And thank you all for joining us. If anyone has any questions throughout the evening, please feel free to either raise your hand, drop the questions in the Q&A box or the chat. We will be monitoring that and ask it for you if you're not comfortable unmuting and asking it yourself, but you can, of course, feel free to do that as well.
So I guess let's get started.
Okay.
So welcome to all of you, and we have an excellent panel today. You definitely met Elizabeth last time, and we have a very experienced grain grower from New Jersey, Mr. Tom Zhang, and we have our wonderful friends, Liz and Ryan. They have been in farming for a long time, and they have started grain growing this year, and they will be sharing their experience and the reason why they started grain growing. So I'm sure we'll have a great discussion. And over to you, Elizabeth, to introduce the team.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in here. I think you should find this a very good session with these excellent farmers that we have on the panel. And I'd like now for the three folks to give a brief introduction so you know who they are as we start getting into the meat of the presentation. So Tom, do you want to start?
Okay. Yes, I farm down near Flemington with my two sons are in the operation as well. And we farm both organically and not organically. I don't know. I think, well, we all together, my boys say we farm about 1,400 acres together. I know that we have cut back on our organic. We used to be over 300. We're now just a little over 200, I think. I'm bad at remembering acreage, but yes, I've been growing certified organic for quite a while. I'm not sure if it's been 25 years yet, but probably pretty close. And prior to that, well, when I started in organics, I thought it was just a matter of, well, all the rotations like I've been doing, but I need a cultivator. Well, it turned out to be a lot more than just cultivating. But anyway, I'm glad to be here. And actually, I think questions are probably the better thing for someone like me. I would much rather have someone ask a question that I could try to answer than to try to lecture. Lecture is not something I'm good at, nor do I really prefer. So that's me.
Thanks, Tom. Liz, Ryan?
Hey, everybody. This is Ryan from Four Fields Farm. And
I'm Liz from Four Fields Farm.
Yay. Together, we are Four Fields Farm. So we started farming 9 years ago. We quit our perfectly good city jobs and started a farm in New Jersey, of course, mostly to give people an option to find more sustainably produced and ethically produced meat. So we're primarily a meat farm. So we do pork, chicken. We had lamb for 6 or 7 years, turkeys, eggs, and then that's our core of the farm. And then as we're finding holes in markets, we try to fill those holes. So now we're growing mushrooms. So that's probably a third of our business. And we just got our cottage baking license last year. and that has quickly taken off to maybe 15% of our business now, something like that. So we're not certified organic, but we're organic practices. It is something to consider now that we're getting into at least small scale wheat production. Maybe we want to certify organic wheat so we can sell the certified organic flour. But I don't know about that. Things to think about.
Yep.
Okay, well, thanks. Liz, did you want to say anything else before we go on?
No, I thoroughly agree with Tom. I'm much better with questions than I am talking about what I do.
Okay, great. Well, let's go to the next slide then. And folks, feel free to ask questions during the presentation. So I just wanted to let you know the kinds of topics we'll be dealing with today. There's going to be a little bit of a review, and we'll push forward on some of the things we talked about last time in terms of crops for our area, time of planting, sourcing seed, land requirement. Then we'll go into some new topics: soil testing and fertilization, field preparation, planting rates. We're going to have a great example then of Four Fields Farms, what they've done this year out of sod into winter wheat. We'll talk a little bit about scouting for weeds and diseases and prevention tips, and then get into what's coming up next in the education series. So that's kind of where we are. And I'm just presenting what I presented last time, just sort of a summary of the small grains and specialty crops that either have strong markets right now or have excellent market potential, and that we can grow in this area. So Tom, can you tell us, can you give us your take on some of these? You've grown a lot of these crops, I know.
Yeah, I've grown a majority of them. Eh, many organically and some not. But since we're concentrating on small grains, certainly grow and continue to grow wheat, barley, rye, spelt, and einkorn. Barley and spelt are not grown organically. I have, but not in the last 2 years. Let's see. Spring, I have grown spring wheat. I would not encourage it. Spring oats, yes, that's fine. I also have grown hulless oats in the spring rather successfully, but you need to find a market for it. Spring barley, yes, I grew that organically. Good quality, poor yielding. Emmer, I have not grown. Einkorn, yes. However, I have always seeded it in the fall. I didn't know it was a spring crop until I began hearing up in Minnesota, where they sell some of this, that it was a spring crop. Well, it's not for us. And flax, actually, I did try flax not too many years ago. That was an utter failure for me. That doesn't mean it's going to be for anyone. I know that the Hunterdon County, which is where I live, a couple hundred years ago, was known for its flax because there was quite a large acreage of it. So, but I don't know. For me, it was a failure. Late spring and summer. Buckwheat, I guess I grew some about 30 years ago. Sure does loosen the soil, and I would encourage it for a soil builder. I did plant a little bit around the edge of a field for a person who wanted to have buckwheat honey. Don't know how she ever made out with that, because I don't know how you tell the bees to just go to the white flowers and nowhere else. But
I've always wanted that too.
yeah. Grain amaranth, no, I've never grown that. Amaranth used to be considered, and I think still is considered, sometimes an annoying weed, but I don't know that that's the same as grain amaranth. Specialty corn, well, I've grown popcorn and red corn, blue corn. I don't grow them anymore. mainly because the market, it would be so minuscule and so specialized, and it's just a little bit novel, but that's about it. Millets I have not grown. Sorghum, yes, I have never grown sorghum organically, but we certainly grow it otherwise. I don't know that there is an organic market for it. There may be, and in fact, since Ryan and Liz, you do the, or you're going to get into to grinding up some of this stuff for flour. I do understand that sorghum flour might be a real up and coming thing, something to think about. Dry beans. No, I don't really grow dry beans. I have grown soybeans organically, but because of the deer overpopulation, it has just gotten out of control. I can't grow them anymore. They wipe me out 100%. So I don't do that. I wish I could. I guess that covers what I see here.
Yes,
Well,
yes.
Tom, there are a couple of things. One,
Sure.
buckwheat. Well, my bees do good, and I do have buckwheat honey, and it's
Good.
really amazing. There's a question for you from Les and Ryan. Is there a
Okay.
reason you grew spelt and barley not organically?
Actually, yes, there is a very good reason, and that is the spelt is and the barley are both grown for a fellow who manufactures feed, and he's close by, and I consider him a friend. So he said, would you grow spelt for us? Because they're cutting back on their farming and just they're getting older, and they're just concentrating on their feed manufacture, and they use spelt in their feed, and he uses barley in their feed. Barley is a very small market. So I said to him, I said, I will grow that for you, but you have to have the storage for it because I'm not tying up anything for spelt or barley. There's just, if we hit a problem, there's just nowhere to move it frequently anyway. So that's why.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment on the grain amaranth. It is in fact a different species. It's related to, you're correct, it's related to red root pigweed, but it's a different species and it's actually a cultivated crop. But
I thought so.
it grows as amazingly as the red root pigweed. It really grows voraciously. Yeah. So, well, thanks for giving us your perspective on those crops. And as you can hear, folks, he has a lot of experience with many of these crops. One thing about einkorn that I should have pointed out last time is I've worked with now about 8 different land races of einkorn, and I have yet to find a land race that can't be planted in both the spring or the fall. Same crop. So that's one of the rare examples we have. And so in Pennsylvania, they're actually growing einkorn as it planted in both the fall and the spring. And the yields of the spring einkorn are not too shabby. So it's something to keep in mind. Next slide. So I wanted to push forward a little bit to talk about time of planting. You know, we've been talking about fall, spring, summer, but we have to get more specific. So for fall planting date for small grains, in your region, I'm always telling people, well, try to aim for around October 1st. Tom, do you want to explain the concept of the Hessian fly free date?
Well, Hessian flies can be a real problem. So the Hessian fly free date it varies, but not very much. It's usually near the end of September, and it'll be broadcast out. I mean, everybody seems to know when the fly free date is, and if not, just call the extension agent and plant after that date. If you plant before that date, you are taking quite a chance because the Hessian fly, well, they'll wipe the crop out. You won't get anything. So that's the worst case scenario, but that's I've I know two people that have had that happen. They thought, well, we'll get our crop in even earlier this year. Well, it works sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't work at all. So the risk is very strong there. So you wanna wait for a fly-free date. If even though you're done and you're raring to go, you might just have to hold on a little bit. And early October is a good time anyway.
Yeah, and so I was looking back at the Hessian fly free date charts for our region. And I was looking at the comments from the extension people, and they're warning us, saying, you know, if your Hessian fly free date is September 25th or so, think about climate change and push back at least a week. Because what happens is that these flies hatch in late summer and they're ready to lay eggs in, you know, the first several weeks of September. So if you're planting then and those flies are around, they'll lay eggs on the young seedlings, and that's the beginning of your problem. So I think, you know, early October is a good thing to aim for. The other thing that this really helps with is if you plant too soon in the fall, you can increase your risk of diseases like powdery mildew and septoria, leaf blotch too, and a couple of other things, even aphids. So you really want to, it's really tempting. You know, the ground is ready to go, but as Tom says, you've got to wait. Now, the problem is you can't wait too long because you have a window of opportunity, but at any moment it could start raining. I know you guys in New Jersey are really hoping it's going to start raining. But there are risks to late, primarily reduced stand, reduced yield, and then greater weed pressure. Remember, one of the great things about a fall planted small grain is that if the stand is sound, if it's a good stand, then your weed problems essentially are gone, right? So, Tom, have you ever suffered from any of those powdery mildew or anything like that?
Oh, I think I have had powdery mildew. I don't I haven't I'd say I probably that goes back a long time ago to when I was just learning about this stuff.
Yeah.
And so therefore, when I'm looking to scout, I look and well, that crop looks all right. But then all of a sudden, 2 days later, well, that crop doesn't look all right. So um and that, and I'm always learning when I'm scouting. So oftentimes, well, I will call either extension or truthfully, you can call your chemical representative and they'll and say, hey, what's going on? And oh, well, we've been out spraying for this or spraying for that. Well, okay, well, that means I might have that here. Now, in organic, obviously, you're not going to be spraying for it, but maybe will be. I don't know what all is available these days. I know the list has really grown tremendously from when I first started, but yeah, that's I have had that, and I haven't really say I've noticed a whole lot more weed pressure. Could be.
Uh-huh.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah,
It
I
makes
think
sense. It makes sense that it would be.
yeah, no,
Yes.
I think the point is that if you know, the later you plant, the chances of your stand being adequate decrease.
Oh,
Well,
yes.
if there aren't a lot of small grain plants there, then offers an opportunity for weeds to get established.
Oh,
So,
yes.
you know, you don't panic if you can't get the grain until October 15th or so. But once you get going into late October and early November, of course, it depends on the weather.
Oh,
You can run into some problems. So it's good to be ready to go with that early October zone in mind, I think. Next slide,
yes.
please. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, my early October wheat is looking pretty good considering there's been absolutely no water since I think August. Well, except we had 3/10 the other night. I'm sorry. That disappeared the next day with the wind.
Something.
But well, what was I going to say about this? The reduced stand and the weed pressure. Yeah, that's definitely there. I know what I was going to say. I was going to say, today I was finally disking a field just lightly because I wanted to get better soil seed contact. I haven't planted any spelt yet, so I'm going to be planting spelt probably in the next couple of days. But you know, it's. I used to have people tell me, the older folks when I was a young fellow, the older folks saying, "Well, we've planted wheat in December. It's turned out all right." Now that doesn't mean it's going to do that every time, but you know, I have seen it. Yeah, it does just all right. You never know, and you cannot foresee. And like Elizabeth said, it's the weather. Who knows? But for us right now, it's so dry, nothing is growing. So I thought, well, if I can get better soil seed contact with this spelt, I'll put it in and hope for the best. And that's all I can do.
And I'm glad you brought up spelt because crops differ in their sensitivity to late planting. Spelt is an excellent example of one that I've known many farmers across the Northeast and into Ohio telling me that they've been able to, they didn't want to plant it that late, but because of weather or whatever, or equipment breakdown, that they've had success planting that in November and even into December. So Tom is right that it's, but
Well,
just
I'm glad to hear you say this.
yeah, no, I think spelt is probably the most frost, is probably the most cold tolerant, even more cold tolerant than rye. So anyway, let's go on to the next slide. So we wanted to talk, so there you have the idea about when you should plant in the fall. How about spring? This is the old saw that I think still holds, but Tom can tell us what he thinks, is as early as the ground can be safely worked. So yeah, so in your area, I think March and April. But let's hear what Tom has to say. So you would have been planting oats and you said you have some spring barley. When do you
Well,
usually get those in?
used to plant spring barley, and it would handle spring barley the same, or any spring crop, the same as I would for oats. I like to be ready to go to plant by the 1st of March. Now, the ground isn't always ready, but usually in March you get at least a week, or I shouldn't say that. I think this year we got about 4 days, and we did get some in, and then of course the rest didn't get until I think later in April. I mean, well through April. So that just happens.
Yeah, and
But
again,
let's shoot for that March. And March oats are always the better ones, even if they don't yield a whole lot more bushels. They're going to be better quality bushels. That's a for sure thing.
yeah, because oats really likes cool, damp conditions.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
and
Which we didn't
doesn't
have
like
this
the
year.
shock of really bad heat. Yeah. But
Right.
so I wanted to make this point because this is something that people keep asking me year after year after year, and I don't think they believe me. And that is that there's a certain point in the spring when if you haven't been able to get the crop in, don't try it. Go with another crop that can be planted later in the late spring or summer. So very often for me, that cutoff point is the end of April. I mean, I might say, well, first week of May. But what happens with all the spring planted small grains is they're very sensitive to temperature, and the temperature particularly affects their ability to tiller. For those of you, tillering is simply the fact that from one plant, many stems can emerge, and that's what's giving you your yield. That's what's making it the plants competitive with weeds. But as the temperature increases, the amount of tillers decreases that the plant can put forward. And so I showed you something. This is from North Dakota. So North Dakota is always about a month to a month and a half behind us. So notice they're starting to plant around April 18th. But notice that look at that slope of the line, how quickly it decreases as it gets later and later. That's the heads per square foot, which is highly correlated to yield. So it's really important. The other thing that's going to happen to you as you delay planting is the increased weed pressure, which can just completely knock out the field. So it's really good to be ready to go. And if something happens, if you can't get the crop in, then don't plant in mid-May or end of May. Go to another crop. I don't know if you concur with that, Tom.
Absolutely. I sure do.
Yeah,
100%.
it's just a losing game. So that's why, that's why spring planting can be a little dicey, because of course you have to do field prep, and you might not be able to do field prep if the weather is against you. So it's a
But
riskier. Go ahead.
I think you're also right. It's also a little dicey just planting some spring crops that are more suited for places like North Dakota, because we do tend to heat up. And maybe that's why I've had problems with trying things like spring wheat and spring barley. Quality was okay, but yield was just poor. Weed pressure didn't seem that bad, but it just I don't think it was really suited to the climate that I'm in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. As I mentioned last time, one of the great options for you in spring planting is emmer. Emmer is one of the ancient wheats, and it is much more tolerant to heat and to weed pressure than its cousin modern wheat. So, and I know that there's a market for emmer. If you're at all interested in that, let me know and I can help you source the seed. But you're getting the straight truth here from Tom. Next slide, please.
Elizabeth, there is a question in the meantime. Any
Sure.
advice on aphid control in organic?
Um, aphids. I have never had serious problems with aphids. You notice, can we go back one slide, please? Yeah, so one of the reasons that you, for example, want to wait to plant your fall planted grains till that Hessian fly free date is that will also minimize your risk of aphid attack. What I can say about aphids in other parts of the growing season is if you have a diverse landscape around your field, I have seen several times in my crops, I'm going, oh no, the aphids have attacked, and then I come back 3 or 4 days later and they're all gone. They're gone because of they've been eaten by uh beneficial insects. So I haven't had has anybody had Tom, have you had problems with aphid infestation?
No, I've only ever even seen them on sorghum
Yeah.
and the green aphids, and really they didn't. I
Yeah,
don't think they really
they're
damaged anything much. So
in an organic or non-chemical system, they're going to be wiped out fairly quickly before they can do
yeah.
a lot of damage. Next slide. So I wanted to go into now more about sourcing seed. Last time we talked about the difference between farm seed and certified seed. So I wanted to give you a little bit more in depth. Here's a list of some seed companies where you can buy bulk amounts, meaning you can get enough seed to plant an acre or 5 acres or 10 acres or whatever. And a really good one is Albert Lee Seed in Minnesota. They have uh, untreated and organic certified seed. They also are starting to carry, I noticed, more heirloom varieties, so check them out. They carry emmer, for example. And they're very high quality. I think a great deal of them. I used to work with them a little bit when I was teaching at the University of Minnesota. There's one very close to us that's a good seed company, King's Agri Seed in Pennsylvania. Some of you may know about this. I think it's in Lancaster or close by, but certainly in Lancaster County. And they have things like buckwheat. They sometimes have oats, but they have a really wonderful array of forage legumes and stuff like
Spelt.
that.
They have spelt.
And they have spelt too?
Yes, unless I cleaned them out.
Okay, yeah, well, that's good. And so there, I won't go through all of these, but some of them are very good for specialty corns. For example, Greenhaven in Western New York, they have a wonderful variety of open pollinated seeds. Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, the same. You also can have some local. I have a store about 15 miles from here that sells a lot of different kinds of grains. So what I would do is check out some of these websites and start looking through, and just like you do if you're a vegetable grower, and start smacking your lips at some of these varieties, you can start looking for seeds. Now, I was asked a question earlier this week. Someone was asking about very specific heirloom varieties. Um, that's great. Usually, these varieties, you're going to need to do some bulking yourself. So they're great seed companies. I've just listed a few. One's very close, the Hudson Valley Seed Company, but there's Wild Garden Seed on the West Coast, So True Seed. They have a lot of different varieties, but they'll only sell you maybe 50 grams or so. So what you can do is plan it out and you know, and then in a year or two, probably you'll have enough to put in a quarter acre, half acre, and you're on your way. But again, I want to mention the fact that certified seed is also something to be thinking about. And we'll get into that at the very end of the presentation, when we get into some diseases. But Tom, you've worked with King's Agri-Seed, any of these others?
Well, I get the Albert Lee catalog, but I guess I did get a little bit from them. Yes, this year, or through my own seed dealer, but it was from Albert Lee.
Yeah, yeah.
And I knew it. And
They
I
have,
have used Greenhaven before too, many years ago.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and Lakeview Organic Grain is a very well-known feed and seed source. That's near
Yeah.
Rochester, New York. And it's well worth looking at their offerings. Okay, let's go on. Next slide. Yeah, so I just wanted to reiterate that the land requirement from last time, that you want loamy, well-drained soil. You don't want to be trying this on very steep slopes. And you need enough land so that you can use a combine and other field equipment. Next slide. Let's get into something new now. So let's talk a little bit about soil testing and fertilization. So I think that soil testing is essential. We're going to hear from Tom, his views in just a second. But my strong recommendation to you is you don't need to spend a lot of money on it. There's some soil testing labs. I have no quibbles with them, but they'll test all sorts of things, all sorts of parameters that maybe I'm not sure are that valuable, and they'll charge you a lot of money. I recommend that you use your local land grant soil lab, which in this case is Rutgers. They charge, $18 to $20 a test, and I think that's a reasonable place to start. Why do you need a soil test? Well, if you're starting out and you haven't been testing your fields, you really need to know. You need to test for those lists of parameters. pH is extremely important. Organic matter in an organic system is extremely important, and then the macro and micronutrients listed there. But Tom, what do you do in terms of soil testing?
Pretty much just like you said, especially if it's a piece of ground that I haven't farmed in a while. Soil test is just, I mean, that's academic. You must soil test, and you got to know what's there to start off with. And you have a pretty good list there. I actually, most of the time, I just test for macronutrients, and the pH test is there. Although I generally pay more attention to the calcium solubility. But oh, phosphorus and potassium. Yeah, I think they magnesium is in there and calcium is in there. Well, actually, I think the last ones I got soil tested had everything in there, including your micronutrients, the copper, the boron, and the iron and the zinc. Yes, fine and good thing. I mean, you can get the micronutrients added often in fertilizer packages. Um, and
or a lot of them with manure application. Yeah.
oh, absolutely. Well, in my organic, it's been very rare, if ever. Well, it has been ever. I have used potassium sulfate, mine potassium sulfate. But other than that, um, everything else has been manure primarily. Well, manure and cover crops, green manures. Um, oh, well, I guess that's
Like legumes. Yeah. Hmm.
oh, legumes. Yes. Well, I use legumes in my rotations frequently. So, in fact, never frequently enough that I'm happy. I want
Yeah.
more.
That's a good way to be. Next slide. So you'll notice that nitrogen is not included in that list, which may seem crazy to you because nitrogen, of course, is an extremely important macronutrient for all the crops you're growing. But the reason that we don't suggest you test for nitrogen is that plant available nitrogen forms, ammonium and nitrate, are ephemeral. They're constantly being sucked up and the levels are constantly fluctuating in the soil, depending on whether crops are growing, weeds are growing, what the weather conditions are. So it really is, it's not very useful to find out at a certain point in time what the concentration is. Better to assess the nitrogen status and the need for nitrogen for the crop you're about to plant by considering the cropping history, the history of fertility management, what inputs have you been using in that field over the last several years, the organic matter content, the organic matter content you'll need to evaluate in terms of whether you have a silty, a sandy, loamy, a silty or a clay loam soil. But that organic matter content is important to know because it can tell you if you have how much, some nitrogen will be released by that organic matter over the growing season. So that's important for you to know. And then very critically, what are the nitrogen needs of the crop that you're about to plant? So to give you an example, let's say you're going into a field that was planted in corn. That's a heavy feeder, but most people are usually applying a lot of fertilizers. Well, maybe you're about to go into a low fertility demanding crop like buckwheat or even einkorn. That is going to be a critical consideration when determining how much or if any fertilizer you need to apply. Same thing is true if you're using the legumes that Tom was talking about. If you've grown a forage legume immediately before the crop you're about to plant, well, you're getting quite a bit of N credit from that. So what the grains, this can get a little confusing when you're starting out, but what we can do is if you take a soil test and we know the cropping history, whether manure has been applied in the last several years, whatever, then we can help you figure out nitrogen and other fertility needs from the crop you're about to plant. And you'll start to gain experience and soon be able to do that yourself. You have any comments, Tom?
I think you covered it pretty well. Nitrogen is probably one of the most obvious problems. If you look and you see there's a problem with the grain, oftentimes it's a nitrogen deficiency. And then you have to decide, is that because there's not enough there, or is it because I'm looking right now and in another week, is the organic matter that's in there going to release some of this? These are all things to consider. And I think you covered it very well, Elizabeth. Yep.
What would you say in your experience over your experience? What elements what macronutrients are more likely to be limiting?
Potassium. Potassium is around us is much more limiting than phosphorus. And again, nitrogen, I don't know. You can't test for it. So I'm not going to say it's limiting for me because I don't think I've really seen tremendous nitrogen deficiencies, but I certainly have seen potassium deficiencies. And I don't like to see that. And yet if you get your soil sample, you can sometimes, well, I guess almost all the time, ask for what their recommendations for fertility is. Now, they're going to just recommend, putting down more phosphorus or potassium, and that's just chemically. Now, that's okay because what they're telling you is you need to get this much potassium because the crop's going to remove so much. Well, it would be really nice if everything worked scientifically like that, but it doesn't. Pound for pound, it just doesn't actually work that way. So but if you're lacking in things like potassium, you can see it in the grain, and you can see it all the time. I think if your potassium and your phosphorus levels are pretty strong and your calcium levels are strong, there's not a lot you're going to be able to do other than your rotations for nitrogen and maybe adding some manure. But even that, it takes a while to break down to get nitrogen. So worry more about other things than your nitrogen, except for when you're planting. Plant legumes if you can to get it, but you really can't worry about nitrogen, but you can't ignore it. I don't know how to say. That's kind of a terrible thing to say. Don't worry about it, but don't ignore it. But that's really
No,
the way.
I know what you're getting at. Let's go to the next slide. I think that's speaking to some of the things you've been talking about. So I wanted to show you, can we get the next slide? No, there should be one. Are you sure that's the next one? Yeah, okay, go back one. Yeah. Okay, so we'll get to this, looking at an actual soil test report in a second. But one of the reasons that you need to test your soils is you need to worry about pH. Grains need at least 6. And there can be a range, 6 to 6.5, 6.7 isn't going to kill you or anything like that. But when you get much lower than 6, you're going to have you're not going to have optimal small grain growth. And if that's the case, then you need to apply lime. And the soil test will actually tell you how much lime to apply. One thing to keep in mind is you should be following, even if you're not certified organic, it's a safe bet to follow the National Organic Program's recommendations, or actually rules. So you avoid hydrated or slaked lime. And if your magnesium is low, you can use dolomitic lime that has both magnesium and calcium in it and is a liming agent. Otherwise, you can apply just calcitic lime. If you have low calcium, that's a good thing to do as well. So this is just a picture of, the mineral dolomite, which is ground up, is mined and ground up to give you
Yes.
the liming agent.
Elizabeth, something comes to mind, and I don't know, but this may be something that Ryan and Liz might consider. Years ago, almost all the lime around this area was spread, and it was dolomitic lime. And dolomitic lime was considered great because there was so much livestock in the area, and they grazed a lot. But when we began growing more crops and there was far less livestock, we found out that the dolomitic lime tended to make the ground harder, I guess you could say, than a calcitic lime. So we're really tend to now go more towards calcitic lime. But that may not be the case for someone like Liz and Ryan. They might want to consider dolomitic lime. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Next slide.
There's another question here related to fertilizing. Can you go over manure application, fresh versus composted, time of year, sources, horse, cattle, chicken, etc.?
Okay, we'll do that. We're gonna hold that for another slide or two, but we'll certainly talk about that. So can we
Thank
go to the next slide? So we're gonna get to that. I just wanted to reiterate on both the macronutrient and pH situation. So here you can see this is an actual test of a New Jersey field in the Highlands region, and you can see that the pH is 5.86. It's outside the optimum zone, and so they're going to be, the soil test will actually recommend a certain amount of pounds per acre, tons per acre of lime to be applied. And then if you look down at the macronutrients, you can see that it'll tell you whether the macronutrients are below optimum or above. And in this particular field, you can see, look at that look at the potassium is particularly low, so is calcium. Phosphorus and magnesium are not quite as badly off, but this is the kind of information you need. And one of the reasons that potassium that I know about, that potassium is a problem on many farms, is that if you're haying the ground and you're selling that hay has a heck of a lot of potassium that you're just taking off the land. So that's something that I can't say enough. It's really good to keep your crop residues on your field. Now, if you're using that for bedding that on your farm, that's fantastic, because you're just recycling it and putting it back on the land in an enriched state. But watch the potassium levels. They can often be very low when you're starting out. Let's go to the question now. You want to go to the next slide? So we've been talking about pH management, but the question is about fertility management and using manures. So Tom, do you spread manure? When do you spread it? What kind of manures do you use?
All the manures we use are fresh. I don't compost anything. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Probably not at all anything wrong with it. Probably a lot of right with it, but it just doesn't fit in our operation. We have used chicken manure regularly. We use cattle manure because we have some of our own, and I have occasionally, whenever it's available, found some outside. But the chicken manure used to always be brought in, and I really liked it. If you want to watch for weed control.
When would you apply it? When do you apply the manure?
Well, many years ago, they used to say you should apply it in the fall for a spring crop. And I did that as much as I could. And then I found that I tend to disagree with that. Actually, I now feel it's more appropriate to put it down in the spring. Now, it takes a while to apply manure. So you want to get it on the ground as soon as you can. You have all winter, so you might try to get it all winter. Now, this past winter was so wet, you couldn't do anything like that. And when it finally cleared up this past year, it was in April. And I said to myself, well, I either can spread manure and then it's going to be awful late planting, or I go ahead and plant and I'm going to be just barely timely to do it because of what the weather has done. And I haven't been able to spread manure all winter long. So I didn't. So hence I
Again,
didn't.
it's very weather dependent. Now
Absolutely.
yeah, you're using fresh manure. You can
Yep.
see, I have a picture here of composting manure.
Mhm.
Some farmers that I know compost manure themselves, some buy it in. The great advantage of composted manure is that you reduce the weight, the bulk, and also it should reduce the amount of weed seeds. Have you had a problem with proliferation of weeds after you apply manure, Tom?
Frequently, yes. I have found that, especially with the chicken manure, for some reason, yeah, you definitely want to get that incorporated, and if you can, plowed down as fast as you can. And but yes, I have, because sometimes you see some weeds that I say, I've never had that problem before. What have I done differently? Well, it might be that you brought them in. That's the danger. Whether it's chicken manure or cattle manure, or any manure, you brought it in, and I think that's what I did.
You make an excellent point. Whatever you do when you're applying anything that has nitrogen in it, so manure or even compost, if you leave that on top of the ground for days and the sun starts to shine and the wind is blowing, you're losing a lot of nitrogen. It's just going to go back into the atmosphere. So, incorporating manure is a really good practice. There are problems with manure. The biggest one for me is the weed seeds, but manure is such a wonderful thing because remember, it's not just a fertilizer and it has all the macronutrients. It has most of the micronutrients. It's an excellent fertilizer, but it also it's a source of, it can really improve your soil structure. It's organic matter, so it's increasing your soil organic matter. And also it has a prolonged effect. Tom was talking about the fact that it's sometimes, especially fresh manure, it's going to take a little while for it to start releasing nutrients to plants. But it also can have an effect over several years. You apply it year one, and still in year 2, 3, 4, 5, you're getting some benefits from it. So it's a wonderful fertilizer. A composted manure is great, but of course it either costs labor if you're doing it on your farm, or it's going to cost you when you buy it. We've talked a lot about forage legumes, how wonderful they are. That's really a fantastic way to go. I've pictured crimson clover there, Tom.
Pretty
What are your favorite forage legumes for your cropping rotation?
well. We use a lot of hairy vetch, and I don't have as much of it anymore, but I like it a lot, and that's yellow blossom sweet clover. Um, the hairy vetch I like because I have found it really smothers if you have a good stand of hairy vetch and a little bit of rye, maybe you won't have a weed in there. The vetch just smothers everything.
And you
Um,
don't have problems with hairy vetch as a weed?
no, I don't. Generally, I don't. Uh, I have had it in my rye, and I don't worry about that because I'm going to be using the rye for cover crop anyway. And rye and vetch is a great combination. But if in my rotation, if I'm using that, say for growing corn, um, once well, vetch makes a pretty purple flower, so the whole field will just be purple when it flowers, and when it flowers, it's at its peak nitrogen. So both above the ground and below the ground. So you want to incorporate it then, because it quickly turns to seed. And once it turns to seed, it's a pretty hard seed and it can stay in the soil a long time. And not really a big problem unless you're like me, where you rotate your crops and you start using small grains. And you don't want vetch in your small grains. That just doesn't work, especially Well, we have two people who do baking. You sure don't want to have any vetch in there, because that would make it awfully bitter flour. And so you don't want it in wheat. Like I say, I don't mind it in rye because that's for a cover crop. But
But if you're growing rye as a cash crop, that would be a problem.
you're right, and I do a little. I do, and I don't want it in there. And so I keep that separate for sure.
Yeah,
Uh,
but I like what you're saying, that the important thing to do is incorporate it at flowering before seeds.
Oh, yes. That's the latest. Once it's purple, you say, I've got to get it in.
Okay.
You can terminate it before then, and it's probably marginally different if it's done a couple weeks before. But if you do it a couple weeks after, then you're going to have a problem. So the pretty purple is and it really is pretty, but it is definitely time to get that stuff terminated, however you do it.
I was just gonna ask that. Can you describe your termination sort of methods? Like, are you mowing and then disking,
No,
or are you just
no, well, it depends. Organically, that's almost always been plowed down. I'll plow it down. If it's not organic, I have just disked it. I'll disc it once in heavily, and that'll pretty much take care of that with a heavy disking. And then I'll disc it one more time and then plant.
So when you say plowing, are you saying like moldboard plow down?
Moldboard. Oh yes, I'm sorry, moldboard plow.
Okay.
I know the moldboard plow is not popular by places like NRCS, but I can tell you, I stopped doing it for a while, and I quickly went back for corn. Um, it's not something you should do year after year after year. You will get erosion problems,
Right.
but you should rotate your tillage as well as your crops, is the way I try to handle it.
Yeah.
We're going to get back into the tillage in just a minute here, but I wanted to
Yes.
point out one more option that I think too many people are relying on. It can be an option, but it's very expensive. So you can buy composted pelleted chicken manure fertilizers, either in the bag or in bulk. And I have a little label there. It says 543, so it's 5% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, 3% potassium. Those are very, very nice. They flow easily if you're using a drop seeder or anything like that. So you can even apply it at top dressing, which we're about to get to in a second here. But the only problem with them is that it can be very expensive, especially if you live far away from where the fertilizer is being produced. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So I just wanted to mention that everybody should be aware of, maybe some of you already are, for your fall planted crops, you can apply a fertilizer at planting, but you also have the option of applying fertilizer at spring green up. And sometimes this is done. So here you can see a field, courtesy of our Penn State friends, that's starting to green up. And that's when I suggest you go out scouting and start checking how many plants, how many live plants you have per square foot. And I can give you this number, but if it's below a certain amount, you might want to think about applying some fertilizer to promote tillering. If you have a less than optimal stand, there's also evidence that applying top dress at spring green up can increase yield and even can increase protein content somewhat. Do you do top dressing at all, Tom?
On my organic, I do less top dressing, but I have been experimenting a lot with. Well, I used to grind up some non-GMO soybeans that I have, and I had mixed them with some blood meal, hoping that, because blood meal just doesn't spread very well at all. So I thought, well, maybe it'll adhere to the soybean a little, and and I spread it out. Well, it was better, but it didn't work very well. So I don't do that anymore either. Still experimenting because I do think that top dressing of small grain is very important. Oh, on my non-organic, you can be sure I top dress. That's more important to me than actually getting fertilizer down in the fall.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily, we're not talking about huge amounts of nitrogen here. Maybe somewhere between 20 to 40 pounds per acre, right? Something like that.
Well, organically, probably that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's when sometimes these fertilizer, these commercial fertilizers can come into play. If you're in trouble with your stand, or you just would like to increase, you're not hitting the protein targets that you want to for your market, you can think about top dressing with, there's several materials available that you can buy, but it is expensive. So you have to figure it that way as well.
But you will definitely see, you'll visually see where if you want to try it, go out and leave a strip untreated and treat a strip, and you'll visually see a difference.
Oh,
and
yeah.
you'll see that difference all the way through.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's worth an experiment. It's always worth keeping something untreated to see if that stuff really works. So,
Yep, that's true. Next slide. Yeah, so this is a very important section here. Now we've soil tested the field. We've been thinking about what we need to apply, if anything. Now comes the tillage part, where we're trying to get the field well prepared so that you can get a really good stand. And there are a couple of scenarios here. So coming out of sod, and this is very often the case with some of the farmers that I'm working with in your area, where you're coming out of either a hayfield or even a fallow area that hasn't been hayed or hasn't been hayed properly. So Tom, what do you do in this situation? What are the implements you use in what order, and what's the time frame?
well, get in and plow, I guess pretty much as soon as you can, and let that sit for a little while. Let the ground, I don't know how to explain this. Let the ground mellow out a little bit, and then disc it again. You might see, you hopefully will see some weed growth after plowing, and then again after the first disking, and then wait a week or maybe 2 weeks. I don't know how long you can wait. It depends on what you're planting and what your optimum time for planting is. And anyway, and then disc it, and I like to run over with a field cultivator one last time to get it done. Now, maybe a spring tooth harrow, if you're going to moldboard plow, a spring tooth harrow would be just fine. That would work well, or even a roller harrow, that works fine too. Anything
Yes.
that'll prep things.
So you start with a moldboard plow, then you wait, you could even wait a week or two before you disc, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
That's a really good thing if you can do that. You should. Yep.
Yeah. And then you
Mother
have
Mother
to,
Nature will take care of a lot of things. So
right. Then you might have to disc more than you're going over the field more than once with the disc, right?
I often do. If the ground is really mellow, you may not have to. Maybe you can just go over it once and then go over with a harrow or a field cultivator, and it's ready to plant.
But
usually I do it twice.
But out of sod, you're almost always going to have to do it more than once, correct? Or not necessarily.
You had two sod things there. One was hay, and then in a hay field, you may not have to do it more than once. You might, but you may not have to. But if you're in just a fallow field situation, probably a pretty good chance you are going to have to, because that ground has not been probably properly cared for some time.
And so here you can see the moldboard plow on the left, the disc on the right top, and then below that the spring tooth harrow. But Tom is also talking about a field cultivator. The spring tooth harrow and the field cultivator are there to kind of level. They're the final pass you would make before planting, correct, Tom?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So let's go to the second scenario. You can see some more of the equipment. So let's say you're following another crop. You're not having to deal with sod. So you don't need to moldboard plow. So in that situation, I think when we were talking earlier, Tom, you say you often will just disc it, right?
Well,
So-
yeah, I can heavy disc, which, well, when I get done, it'll look like it's all been plowed, actually.
Yeah.
And then I might disc it lighter again too. But it is important to recognize it takes a long time. You're not going to just run out and buy this equipment, each one. It's going to take a long time, and then you got to utilize it all. So, I have a heavy disc, and then I have another disc that's more of a finishing disc. And I have actually a third disc, which is really a finishing disc, but I don't use it much anymore. But
You do use your field cultivator.
I do use the field cultivator, yes. Yep. And
Now, what we're pointing out to you here is that you have options, and as you're going to hear from Ryan and Liz, you can also borrow some of this equipment.
yes, and that's what you need to do. You need to borrow, or there has been more than once before I had a field cultivator. I used a spring tooth harrow, but even before I had a spring tooth, I disked it another time, anything to get through, and if I had to. And and then eventually, yes, you might find somebody who wants to swap with you, or just loan you something, or you swap them labor for equipment or anything like that. It all takes a long time before you have a whole bunch of people come to borrow from you, but it's kind of nice when that happens.
Yeah, so here again, we have the disc on the left and a field cultivator on the right. Let's go on to the next slide. So sometimes, and you're going to see an example of this when Liz and Ryan start to speak, you might want to plant a cover crop before planting your main crop. That can really help to create better tilth in the soil. You might need to plant a legume to add nitrogen if your organic matter is low. And you can also suppress weeds. This is a experiment I ran in the University of Minnesota. I ran a 105-acre organic farm, and we had patches of thistle. So what we did is we first did this on our station. We just planted buckwheat to see how suppressive it is. And you can see there on the left with no buckwheat, that's all thistle. And on the right, the buckwheat is pretty much suppressing the thistle. So we tried this on a farm scale, and we found the same thing. Buckwheat was the best. Sorghum Sudan also did a really good job of suppressing thistle. So this is something to think about, is planting a cover crop before you plant your first cash crop. Not necessarily have to do that, but it's not a bad idea in many situations.
Elizabeth?
Yes.
Hi, so we have a thistle problem, but we also have a mugwort problem.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah, and excuse me. Just a second. Yeah, so I looked up mugwort because where I am and where I've been working, I haven't come across it, but basically you should use the same techniques that you use to combat Canada thistle, and that's competition from a weed suppressing crop. The good thing about mugwort is that if there is anything good about it, is that its roots are shallower than Canada thistle. Canada thistle will go down 3 feet.
Yeah.
Mugwort is I think confined to less than a foot. but you can use the same techniques, and I'll be getting into that a little bit later, but certainly a weed suppressive cover crop is an excellent way. Also, something like alfalfa, where you're doing two things there. The alfalfa is heavily competing against the weed, but then you're also mowing. If you have a good mowing routine, you're going to keep weeds like mugwort and Canada thistle well controlled. Next slide, please. So we're finally at planting. The field has been fitted with various tillage implements, and we went through this last time. The best thing to do is to use a grain drill, but you can also spin on the seed with a spin seeder. And Tom, do you want to talk about the grain drill a little bit?
Before you speak, Tom, for both of you, Elizabeth and Tom, there is a question. Hope for some info on drilling buckwheat.
Yeah, we're going to get to, this is what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, exactly.
So a grain drill will plant buckwheat. And what you'll see the planting rates in the next slide, but what I suggest you drill buckwheat at is about 50 pounds to the acre if you're going for a cash crop. If you're going for a cover crop, then I would recommend a much heavier seeding, maybe up to 80 to 100 pounds, especially if you have heavy weed pressure or very pernicious perennial weeds. So the grain drill can be used to in fact, Meg and Ryan and Liz are going to be talking. They did exactly that, right? You planted with a drill, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're gonna cover that a little bit more. Feel free to ask more questions. If I'm not answering your question, it's pretty easy to plant buckwheat. You can also spin buckwheat on and be very successful in establishing it, but then you have to increase your seeding rate. So Tom, what were you going to say about the?
Oh, what was I going to say? I was listening about the buckwheat. Boy, that first brings me back over 30 years ago. But
Yeah.
I wonder if that person had a trouble with the drill. Does buckwheat have it has a shell on it, doesn't it?
It's in a hull, but it's not a terribly large seed. I've never had it plug up. I planted a lot of buckwheat with a grain drill, but
I wonder
maybe
if it cracks the hulls. And
um
if it's set too close. And grain drills, there's more than there's at least three that I know of, different type of mechanisms for seeding. The old one you see in here has fluted coulters, and that as long as he doesn't have his grain gate closed too much, it should be fine for buckwheat. That's how I
yeah,
plant.
yeah, yeah. We'll
But I
hear
don't know
when
if he had any trouble with it, or if it was just a question of seeding rate. I don't know.
yeah. We can see what other questions he or she has. But anyway,
Okay.
one thing to keep in mind with these grain drills is that there'll be settings there. There'll be a setting for oats, there'll be a setting for wheat, blah, blah, blah. But
Yeah.
my strong recommendation to you is to calibrate when you're starting to use your grain drill, because very often what you think you're planting, the rate, you suddenly find out you've planted all your seed and you're only halfway through the field.
Yeah, that happens.
So we'll, in the grain manual that we're about to produce for you, we'll show you some easy ways to calibrate, and also there's some great videos online that you can take a look at. Let's go to the next slide because we're kind of getting low on time here. Yeah, so people had asked if you're spinning on, what do you do? You can't just let those seeds lie on the surface of the ground unless it's you're frost seeding. But you can, after you spin on the whatever you're planting, you can use something like a spike tooth harrow and then follow that with a roller or a cultipacker to get good seed to soil contact. So it can be done, and you even can attach. Yeah, that's actually after a drill, but yeah, so again, the spike tooth harrow is there are a lot of old spike tooth harrow rounds that are pretty cheap. And you can also find used cultipackers, which is always a good implement to have.
So what,
Let's go on.
sorry, Elizabeth. What we used is we just had a really heavy chain that we looped to the back of our cedar, and we just dragged it behind it, and that worked really well.
Yeah, Tom had actually suggested that as well, correct, Tom?
Oh yeah, you an old chain, or people used to just chain logs or anything behind them. Yeah, on a grain drill, but not with just a spinner seeder.
Yeah, yeah. So the spin seeder is going to take a little bit more to get the seed actually incorporated in the soil a bit.
You want better contact, yeah.
Yeah, and that's where the cultipacker or the roller is really critical.
Yeah.
And again, with the spin seeder, you're going to increase your planting rate. So if you're growing a cash crop, instead of planting at 50 pounds per acre, I'd put it on at 70 pounds per acre, something like that. So it's going to require more seed because you're going to lose some. Some will not be in the proper position to grow. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so here are some more planting rates, and I'm not going to belabor these. What I want to point out to you is notice that there's a range, right? So when you ask farmers, and I've asked farmers all over the world what rate they're planting their wheat, you get wildly different answers. So these are some suggestions. You notice that Mike Bakke last time he was saying he'd brought his rye seeding rate way down to about 70 pounds per acre. That's what works for him. But when you're starting out, I would be more generous. I would go for the upper range rather than the lower range of what I have here, just until you get your feet wet and you get more experience with planting. So, and notice that, you know, the small grains tend to be pretty much the same, except oats, and especially hulless oats, you're planting at a lower rate. But it sometimes depends on whether you're planting in the hull or out of the hull. So if you're planting spelt in the hull, you're going to want a higher seeding rate than if it's dehulled for you. With buckwheat, again, you know, there are differences if you want a cover crop, a really, really thick stand, or if you're going for grain production. So just be aware that there's no one magic number for each crop. And again, you have to take it into consideration the circumstances. Let's say you're late planting. If you're late planting in the fall, I'd use a higher seeding rate for sure. Anything you want to add, Tom?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so planting rates for legume interseeds. If you're planting in the spring with the grains, there are some suggested seeding ranges. Crimson clover is a larger seed, so you need a higher rate. You can see that the others are pretty similar, but when you frost seed, now this is something that we checked me with Tom. I recommend a heavier seeding rate if you're frost seeding. What do you frost seed, Tom?
Oh, I certainly have. I don't always every year, but I certainly have. And no, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I've never seen anything about a seeding rate for frost seeding. So I always just used to, oh, of course you're broadcasting, and I used to just do it. Basically, I'd hope for the same rate as, maybe 10 pounds to the acre of alfalfa or clover. And however, now that I'm looking at that 25 pound, yeah, I can believe that without any question.
Well, I'm getting that rate from farmers, from other farmers who do a lot of frost seeding.
Okay.
But no, I just wanted to show you again that you can put it on in several different ways. I've always done it with a handheld spin seeder, but the acreages I've been covering have been just a couple of acres. You notice
Uh-huh.
you can rig up a drop seeder. The key, however, Tom, is time of day when you do this, right?
Oh gosh, well, you'll know when it's too late because your boots will just you'll grow 2 inches in no time, and it just is a mess. And
So
if you're driving something, well, you'll just start tearing up the ground because it's about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and you're done. So,
yeah, so you want to get on the field no matter how you're applying it when the ground is still frozen, right?
oh
And
yeah,
then
that's
get off.
important.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's how the seed gets incorporated into the soil because you're not going to be rolling it or anything like that. So the heaving and thawing from the frost is what's going to incorporate the seed.
So again, this is in your area. That's probably late February, maybe, or even early February, sometime in there.
Oh yeah. Ideally, yes, in February. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Next slide. Okay, so we've been talking about the process of getting ready to plant your crop, the stages that you go through, but we thought that it would be really neat for you to hear right from people that have just done this and hear what they have to say. We've been talking, well, Tom isn't talking theory, he's talking experience. I'm always the theorist, but now we're going to see how these new grain farmers have handled this process. So please take it away, Liz and Ryan.
Sure thing. Um, so I just want to say to start that we really wouldn't have gone into uh, growing wheat on a small scale if it hadn't been for three things. The cottage license for us that basically allows us to bake in our home kitchen, so we don't have to have the expense or the hassle of finding a certified kitchen. Um, so basically, we have a room in the corner of our house that we've dedicated as a second small kitchen. So there's a bread oven and a mixer in there. It's very simple. Uh, so that we have a market for, our product basically. Um, so New Jersey just passed that maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago. We wouldn't have gone into it without the help from the food shed and from Elizabeth and from other experienced people. And we certainly wouldn't have done it without the mill at Marksboro Mill. So River Valley Community Grains and the work that they're doing is a huge outlet for us because they have a certified space to mill the grains into flour that we can then use. So it takes out, like, we use their expertise to help us get a value-added product onto the farm. Otherwise, we'd have to buy a flour mill, we'd have to buy grain cleaners and, all this other stuff just to make 1 pound of flour. So that was a huge incentive and kind of helping us, certainly. So next slide. So pretty much we did what Elizabeth told us to do. So we, reached out to Food Chain Alliance and their grain growing program, put us in touch with Elizabeth. She came out, did a site visit. So you can see we have a pretty flat farm, 20-acre field to play with in the back that historically had been farmed really hard and heavy between sod and corn, soybeans, very chemical intensive, big machinery. We've seen some of the equipment going up and down the road, and I have no idea how they didn't sink into our soil. So when we first started the farm, we didn't want to spend a lot of money on big equipment. So stuff that we're using is a 40 horsepower tractor. We're lucky enough to have found a guy that has lots of older equipment, and we don't need new shiny stuff. So we bought the plow that you can see, 2-bottom plow, which was fine for the 40 horsepower tractor. I wouldn't go much more than that because it did bog down a couple times here and there. It also might be my inexperience with a moldboard plow. You can do the next slide. So the biggest learning for me when it comes to starting doing field work is to really take the time to learn your equipment. So like this field, I think is the first field that I did, and it's pretty awful. The flipping the sod, you know, getting like I really didn't appreciate how much time it took to get the plow set up just right into that sweet spot. And I wasn't flipping the sod well. So because we're doing things organically, you have to flip it well or else you're not going to kill it. And then the next steps of disking and trying to get that field flat was an absolute nightmare because I'm getting tossed around the tractor, bouncing around like crazy, and it's, you know, just really frustrating. So just really take the time to get that first couple rows, you know, flipped over well, get it nice and straight. Because each time you drive over it again, it'll kick you out and you'll pick up the bottom of your plow and then you're not cutting the grass right. And it was just, it was a learning experience. That's for sure. And so next slide, yeah, so we did 6 inches deep moldboard plowing, which we bought the plow and the grain drill for $800. The old, very old set of lighter discs on the left, we found basically at another farm, and that person didn't want it. Like we just pulled it out of the weeds, put it on a trailer and took it to our place. And, you know, it works well enough as a finishing disc. We do have neighbors with bigger farms and bigger equipment. So I traded him drilling in some buckwheat seed for him doing some field work for us. So he, you know, drove over. Luckily, he's maybe a half a mile away. And so he helped do some of the heavier disking on the field that I did a really shitty job plowing. So he kind of saved me on that one. And then other learning, like Tom said, is that it takes time. You really have to set aside the time to do the field work and do it well, because if you don't do it well, at least in an organic system, you're not going to get like a good kill on the weeds. And if you don't have good prepped fields, drilling in the seed is not going to go well because they're all uneven and everything like that. But just the fact that it, you know, it takes 2 or 3 weeks for grass to die. So you really have to let Mother Nature, you know, give it the time to do that work for you. So we disked a couple passes, and then this was in June, mid-June, I think. And then we waited a couple weeks, did another pass or 3 or 4 with the discs. And the next slide, we drilled in buckwheat cover crop.
Next
So,
slide.
oh yeah, there we go. There's our lovely ancient grain drill that we got. Works totally fine. Again, you know, take the time to learn that equipment. And what I did was inside where you put the seed in the grain drill is in a nice big fat Sharpie, you know, permanent marker, write down the settings that you used. Because if you put it on a piece of paper, you're going to lose that. You know, so I know that gear number 3 at this setting, you know, gives me 90 pounds per acre for buckwheat. And then gear number 4 gives me 150 pounds per acre of winter wheat, you know. And I took the time to put in, you know, 150 pounds and said, okay, this section of field is 1 acre. I seeded it, and then, halfway through, you see how much seed you have left. So you're not leaving yourself in a lurch, basically driving around a field and not putting any seed down. So next slide. So that's the buckwheat getting drilled in and then sprouted on the left. And then I was astounded at how fast and how thick the buckwheat came up. I mean, it was 3 feet tall. This is me mowing it down. That's why I was asking you, Tom, how do you terminate your cover crops? Because I had a heck of a time killing buckwheat with a brush hog, because it's a pretty soft stem, and you driving over it, it just lays down. So I would end up with 2 rows of nicely laid down buckwheat that would then turn a right angle and start growing again. So I did, after the initial mowing, waited a week or 2 and then did a pass with the discs to finish terminating it, and then disked that in so it would break down. Because Elizabeth, you had a good point that buckwheat can suppress other, like your fall planted wheat. Was it allopathic? Was that the word, Elizabeth?
Yeah, allelopathic, yeah.
Allelopathic, yeah.
So how long did you leave the buckwheat to be incorporated in the soil before you planted your wheat?
So we terminated it, and then I waited probably 2 to 3 weeks to let it decompose on the surface and keep the soil covered, because this was kind of July, early August. And I, didn't want to plant until October, so I was kind of stalling. I didn't want to have bare soil in the summer heat and storms. So then I waited about 3 weeks. So probably first week of September, last week of August, I disked the buckwheat under. So I would only see soil. And then, waited 4 weeks. And then first week of October, we got Redeemer. Yeah, we went with a winter planted Redeemer. And it's sprouted, and I don't know how it sprouted because it hasn't rained since. And yeah, it's probably 4 or 5 inches tall right now, and growing well. I think next slide you can see that maybe. Yeah, and there it is. Ta-da! Yeah, that's from maybe three weeks ago. There's still leaves on the trees. Yeah, so I don't know how tall it should be now, because I know this is a strange year with no rain, and warmer temperatures than normal. So I don't know what it should look like, but it looks good to me. I mean, it's the grain drill, seems to be working. Again, I'm learning how far I need to overlap to get good coverage.
I can see that.
Yeah, I'm working on it. So yeah, this is like the second field, which, to Tom's point, to kind of experiment with things. So I did 2 fields. We have 3 1-acre fields because there's some ditch work in between them. So I seeded 1 field, let it sit for a couple days, and then it actually just started to sprout, so I could see how I wasn't overlapping enough with the grain drill that I have. So then the next field, I seeded in a different kind of pattern, and that worked much better. The buckwheat seed I got from the Seedway rep in Harmony. They had, non-GMO. I forget, Elizabeth, what there's a specific term for the buckwheat, like open source or something. I forget. But that was super easy to get that seed as a cover crop. And then the winter wheat we got from River Valley Community Grains at Marksboro Mill. They were kind of the middle, the go-between. And that is bin run seed from Coldbrook Farm, which is a certified organic farmer in New Jersey. Really nice, super clean. Yeah. Next slide. So that's kind of it. I mean, our plan for the wheat is, we're going to use it in our cottage baking because we're already going to markets. It's going to be a nice value added product because we can sell the wheat berries, we can sell the flour, or we can sell the bread, so it gives us a bunch of different ways. And then our goal eventually is to have 2, maybe 3 fields that of the 20 acres or so that are tillable land. So maybe have 6 to 9 acres of different fields so that one year is planted in wheat, and then the other field that we just harvested the year before would be planted in kind of a grazing cover crop, and then we'll run our pastured chickens, mostly pastured poultry over that to get, to rest the land and also to get more nutrients in it. So kind of having the animals spread their own manure as they go instead of us spreading the manure. Although we do spread manure as well. And because we process birds on our farm. So we have composted wood chips mixed in with the feathers, the guts and the blood meal from the poultry processing.
And the mushroom blocks.
Yeah, and the spent mushroom kind of substrate. So good organic matter as well.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Ryan and Les. It was a wonderful presentation. Time check. We have another 10 odd minutes. Elizabeth, over to you.
If I can just jump in real quick, you guys, I think this might be a good slide to address a question that came in on the chat, asking Tom to go over again regarding vetch and rye. Lenny, I don't know if you want to come off mute and maybe give a little more context to your question.
Yes, thank you, Tess. Hi, Tom. I just heard before you had said with rye as a cash crop and vetch gets in there, you had mentioned it does affect the flour when it's
can.
milled. I mean, the stone mill will pulverize it, but I guess it would still affect the quality of the flour.
Yeah, because it kind of affects probably the flavor, I would imagine, because it's the seeds of vetch are very bitter. It's not like you can put a handful of seeds or berries or whatever you want to call them from wheat into your mouth and chew on it. It just turns to gum. Not the same with vetch. Vetch kind of tastes okay when they're green and soft like peas, but boy, once they're hard, oh no, not at all. And I would say they're not real palatable. So yeah, I would think you probably wouldn't want that. You can get it in rye, you can get it in wheat, you can get it in anything. It happens. But it can really contaminate it terribly if you're not careful. So it's a very good soil builder. I say it's just about second to sweet clover because sweet clover has a better taproot. But wow, it's good stuff. But it's like anything good, it's good in its place and it's good in its quantity. Too much of a good thing is not a good thing. And that's kind of the same with vetch. You have a little tiny bit in there, nothing to worry about. But if you have a little more in there, you got a problem. Or use it for something else and it won't be a problem. Use it for a cover crop, say, and it's not a problem. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
So, So I want to first apologize a little bit. I have a bad case of bronchitis and I've been muted here and coughing my head off. I just want to get us through a couple more slides, and I apologize if I have to stop. But we've talked a lot about hairy vetch, and that in a cash crop that you're going to mill, you need to clean that out. Another big problem, especially in spring wheat or spring grains, can be ragweed. You can see that down in the corner there. The problem with ragweed is not only that it will reduce yield, but that it will transfer a off flavor to the grain. So if you have a ragweed infested wheat crop, this is why you're scouting your field. So we've planted the crop. If it's a winter crop, we've maybe frost seeded it. Then you're just waiting, but you're also going out and scouting it as it's growing during the growing season. You're looking for weeds. And if you see a lot of ragweed, that means that when you're combining in the combine bin, you're going to have a lot of wet green ragweed pieces in with your grain. Within 24 hours, you need to get that stuff out, or it will cost you your marketability. And fortunately, Marksboro Mills, River Valley Community Grains has a machine called a centrifugal Sosnowski grain cleaner that does a wonderful job. So you can solve that problem. And we've talked a lot about thistle. We're running out of time. I won't go into it more. Let's go on to the next slide. Yeah, I wanted to point out some really great resources that you have. Cornell has a whole bunch of weed ecologists on staff, and they do a fantastic job of giving folks information. So this is just their article on common ragweed. Next slide. Next slide. It'll go through how to identify it, a description of the plant. Next slide. And then it'll give you management advice, which is, yeah, sure, they have some herbicides in there, but most of it is geared toward organic or alternative sustainable farming. And so they give you some really good tips on how to manage. So you could look up mugwort, for example, and get lots of information. So this is what you can Google is, the word Cornell and then the weed that you're interested in finding out about, and you'll get into their little encyclopedia, and it's a wonderful, wonderful resource. Next slide, please. When the grain is starting to head out, you're also going to be scouting for diseases. We talked a lot last time about Fusarium graminearum, scab or head blight. This affects barley, wheat, rye, corn, although in corn it's a different variation, and a weak host is oats. And so what you can look for in your field is, once the heads have formed, notice on the left there, you can see some that are bleached out, right? That's Fusarium. And then later in the season, if the conditions are right, you might see these pink concretions on the kernels. So the importance of scouting is, if you start to see this, well, you have Fusarium. You don't know yet that it's actually causing the grain to be contaminated with vomitoxin, but you can take precautions. So for example, often you'll find these symptoms of Fusarium confined to certain parts of the field. For example, if a field is close to a ditch that often has water in it, along that ditch you might have more Fusarium. So what you can do is you can combine the areas that are badly affected and store them separately from the areas that look much better, and then do your grain quality testing. And you may be able to salvage at least part of the field. So it's important to scout for these things, and these are very distinctive symptoms. Next slide. Next, yeah. You asked about ergot claviceps purpurea. This is a famous, famous disease. And you can see now what the main symptom is. This is usually visible much later in the season than the first signs of fusarium. And you can see these sclerotia. Those are those maybe tests you can point them out with your pointer. Those, they're either purple, brown, or almost black. Yeah. And this is where the floret has been infected. And so instead of a grain forming, this is the one of the reproductive ways the fungus continues to reproduce. These are extremely poisonous. The FDA standard is you shouldn't have more than 4 of these per pound of flour. But you really, if you're going to sell it to a mill, you're going to have a lot less. You can clean this out. And the good news is that the grains on the same head are not affected. They're fine. It's just you just need to get rid of the sclerotia. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, so the last one I wanted to go over is loose smut. And this is a sneaky one. This you'll see as soon as the heads have formed, you'll see some things sticking up that look sort of sooty black. That's loose smut. And so that whole head is gone. It's just fungus now. And the sneaky part about it is that this will happen in a period of 1.5 to 2 weeks. These things form and then very quickly they're blown apart. And so you can't see them anymore. But the problem with loose smut is it reduces your yield. Every single one of those that forms, that's not wheat that you grew or not barley that you grew. And if you keep this is seed borne, this disease, it's inside the seed. So if you harvested this crop and you planted it again, then the next year many more of the plants will show this. So you're really driving down your yield. So this is something to watch out for. And if you do experience it, again, the grain can be sold for milling. There's nothing wrong with it, but you shouldn't plant it because it's just a losing game. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to go over some things we talked about last time and reiterate them. How do you prevent those diseases? We've just now been scouting for them, right? You practice crop rotation, specifically try as much as you can to alternate grass crops, which are the grain crops, with dicot crops, okay? You want to till in crop debris and sclerotia. That destroys it. And a good idea is to keep vegetation at field edges mowed. And then again, use clean seed. Do not plant contaminated seed. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate how we can help you, Ryan and Liz went over this a little bit. So we start with a farm visit. We can do multiple consultations on fertility management, finding the equipment you need. A grain manual is coming that you can refer to. We'll help you source inputs. And then we are going to be able by next year to start lending out equipment, combine, grain drill, and moisture meter. Next slide, please.
Hey, Elizabeth, there's a quick question. Could you quickly suggest basic rag wood control? Rag rot control. I mowed it, bad idea. It became a perennial.
I didn't hear the question, I'm sorry.
Could you quickly suggest basic rag rot control? I mowed it, bad idea. It became a perennial.
I didn't hear the weeds you're talking about.
Very good.
Yes, can you help?
Chris, if you want to come on off of mute and explain a little bit more. It says ragwort. Does that also refer to ragweed as we were discussing?
Yeah, I think ragweed is the same thing. I had a like a low input meadow, and we let the ragweed get out of control. I thought, oh, I can deal with that. I'll just mow it because it's what we do on the field edges. And I mowed it, and well, wherever I mowed one ragweed plant, several more came up in the same place the following season. And
Yeah,
I
well,
think
ragweed is an annual. It's not a perennial. And what
it's
happens?
a biannual, I believe.
No, it's
No?
actually an annual, but
Okay.
unless you're talking about a different species. But go ahead and check me on that. You can now go to that Cornell site and find out all about.
Yeah, you
But,
already answered the question, really. So,
pardon me?
but you already answered the question in after I asked it.
Okay,
So,
okay.
but thank
Yeah,
you.
so what you're dealing with the annual weeds is an explosion. You know, it depends on when you're mowing. Remember what Tom said about preventing hairy vetch from becoming a weed. You've got to get it before it sets its seed, right? So the same thing is true of all these weeds we're talking about. So the action that you should take should be before seed set. And then you still got a reservoir of all these seeds in the ground. So it's going to take a couple of years to control. And I'd be more than happy to work with you on this problem because it is solvable. It just takes some strategies. But start with that nice article in the Cornell weed encyclopedia. That'll really help. Again,
We'll do, Elizabeth. Thank you.
I'm sorry about
So,
my voice, folks. I'm just
s-
teetering on the edge of a paroxysm here. So
no worries, Elizabeth. Just take rest. I will take these slides. And thank you so much for your effort. And in spite of your illness, you're were absolutely amazing today. Thank you. And the this series of education which we are conducting for all of us farmers, there is a third one which will be now held on December 7th at Marksboro Mills, and will have a very um, well-known and experienced farmer, Thor Oshner, uh, and he will be talking about the combine, how to use combine, basics about the harvesting and post-harvesting both. And we'll have Elizabeth, we'll have other farmers. So there will be a lot of interaction and Q&A possibilities. I will request all of you to make some time and be available on 7th in person at Marksboro Mills. The details are there in the invite, and it will be a wonderful session. We are all really looking forward to it, and it's absolutely free of cost, open to all. So please feel free to come with your friends, bring more farmers with you. Uh, it'll be a pleasure to host you all at Marksboro Mills. And we are already gone 3 minutes past the time, but do we have any last minute questions for our amazing panel of Elizabeth, Tom, Liz, and Ryan? Any questions for the team? If not, please feel free to drop me an email with your questions, with your suggestions, with your inputs. I'll be more than happy to get back to you and try my best to get you the answers ASAP. And yeah, Elizabeth, you wanted to say something, looks like.
no, sorry.
Okay.
Well,
So,
let me just say I wanted to thank everybody for attending and to really thank our panel, Tom, Ryan, and Liz. Really appreciate your participation and sharing your experiences. I learned a lot. Thanks so much.
and thank you, Tess, as always, for supporting and doing a phenomenal work in organizing this presentation. I'm grateful to you. Thank you all and have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye.